Welcome back to the second half of this thing, replacing the starter clutch. Now, before we start, a couple of things, a couple of caveats. This is not, it shouldn't be inferred as a tutorial. I just show you how I do it, because over the years I've seen all sorts of weird damages, broken parts, bent parts, because people did not really know how to take this thing apart, and they had way more confidence than competence, and as a result they damaged something. So I try and show you how to protect your engine, and the reason is Viragos are fairly cheap, they are fairly old, so most people don't really want to spend money on a professional mechanic or services of a professional mechanic to fix stuff, and even though they are not really competent themselves, they give it a go. I see that over and over again, that people don't really know their limitations. So in this case I'm going to show you how I do it without breaking stuff, and maybe there will be some of you who will benefit from this. Now, as you can see, I'm draining the oil at the moment, and I'm going to do things with jump cuts because my space is very limited. I don't have much room. Now the point is, I'm going to do jump cuts because otherwise I just don't have the room to move about. So first of all, I'm going to start disassembling or getting stuff out of the way. The footrest hanger, this chrome bar, I'm going to get this out of the way. They're rather easy. You just undo the bolt that holds it to the front of the engine, undo the bolt that holds it to the back of the engine. You undo this pinch bolt that holds the shifter linkage, or the shifter connection to the actual shift shaft. So we have to undo that. Right, I'll be back as soon as I remove this, undoing this bolt and the bolt on the front of the engine. I'll undo this, disconnect the shifter linkage, and I'm going to fling the crash bar out of the way as well, and we'll get back to this video. Okay then, phase 2 is coming up. As you can see, we removed the footrest bracket and the crash bar is out of the way, and now we are going to disconnect the clutch cable, and we're going to open up the solenoid cover. Now, as far as the clutch cable is concerned, it is very simple and you don't have to adjust anything. You just take these bolts out, disconnect the cable from the handle, or the lever rather, and you can unhook the cable from the actuator. You do not have to do anything else. I've seen people messing up the clutch actuator because they took everything apart thinking that they need to take everything apart. No, you don't. Just unhook the cable, and that's it. And I'm going to take this cover off, and I'll be back as soon as all of that is done. Alright, I'm back, and as you can see, the clutch cover is off, or the clutch actuator cover is off, because the actual clutch cover is on the other side, and the solenoid cover is also off. The next step would be unhooking the cable, which now, since the lever up there is already disconnected, will be pretty easy. We just pull the cable down with a pair of pliers, and we are going to unhook it from there, and then we can pull the whole thing out. And once that is done, there are two screws holding the solenoid cover, here and here. We need to remove those. And yeah, I'll be back as soon as that is done. The solenoid cover is loose, as you can see. These two bolts are removed. You need a long JIS screwdriver to access the bolts that hold the cover. And like I said, you just unhook the cable from this tab, and then the Jesus Christ, so the cable can be removed, and it's just hanging, so put it out of the way. Now the next thing we have to do is disconnect the mechanism that I refer to as the seesaw, and we also have to remove these two 10mm nuts that hold the solenoid. One more thing, before you do that, I would recommend disconnecting the battery. The point is, disconnect your battery, because once the solenoid is loose, it can hang about and it can touch the engine, causing a short and whatnot. You don't want that. So disconnect your battery, and I'll undo these bolts and I'll come back and show you the next step. Okay, as you can see, the nuts are removed, the cover is loose, so the solenoid is loose, and as you can see, it moves. Now the next thing we need to disconnect is this and the shaft that Jesus Christ, the seesaw is tilting around. So that here, and that is just an M5 Allen from here, and that is a Torx T30, like so. I'll be back as soon as everything's removed and we are ready for the next step. Okay, the shaft of the seesaw mechanism is removed, the Torx countersunk bolt is removed, and now we just grab this bobbin here and just fling this out of the way. And I'm not sure if you can see, but there is a hook on the end of the solenoid's actuator, and you just unhook this and leave it like that, so you remember the orientation. Leave the bobbin on and put this to one side. By removing this, we removed the lever that connects the solenoid to this Bendix fork, and usually people forget about this, and when they take this thing off, they try to pry the cover off and they bend the Bendix fork. Well, the end is right here, and yeah, that's how that usually gets damaged. As you can see, there's no oil in here, that's just the grease. I have a tendency to lube everything up to, well, if anything else, keep rust at bay, so no oxidation should occur, and that keeps this mechanism move rather smoothly. So now the next thing we need to do is get rid of the hex, the Allen head bolts that hold the cover, and we also need to disconnect this, which is the neutral sensor down there. Other than that, I think we're pretty much ready to crack the case. So I'll take the bolts out. I have a small piece of cardboard, and I'm going to put them down there on the cardboard in an order, so I know where they came from. Some people just draw the outline of the engine cover on a cardboard, and they just poke holes into it, and they place the bolts they removed to the corresponding spot on that outline. I just mark my number 1, and I'll just put them in a row, and that is going to be my number 1, and I'm going to put them like so in that order on my cardboard, so I know how to put them back. So yeah, without further ado, I'll just remove those bolts and I'll be back as soon as the cover is ready to go. Right, so all the little Allen head bolts are removed. Mind you, there's 12 of them, and a couple are hiding, or you might not realize that there's a bolt. 1, 2, 3, 4, that's the hidey one. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. I'm not sure if it was visible, but the point is there are 12 Allen head bolts, and that bastard is hiding, and that one is not too easy to spot either. Now at the moment everything's ready to let go. As far as the clutch is concerned, like I said, you just unhook this. Most people make a mistake when they try to undo the adjuster section of it, because oh, that probably has to come out. No, don't touch that. Unhook the cable and you're golden. Now at the moment all that holds the cover is essentially the magnetic force of the flywheel, or the rotor at the end of the crank, and as you can see it moves. Now for the next step I'm going to need both hands, so I'll be back as soon as the cover is off, and I'm going to fling this out of the way in that direction. Okay, so I'm going to put something under it, like a piece of wood or something, and I'll be back soon. I am halfway off. The reason I stopped is to show you that it started separating nicely, and to remind you that the starter gears in there are loose, and the only thing that keeps them together is, or that keeps the starter gears in the inside of the engine, or the inner case half, is the Bendix fork that I mentioned, and that is that end of the shaft. So when you pull this off, try to keep your thumb in there, or you can also take that countersunk screw, put it back, and that gives you a bit more travel, or gives your finger a bit more travel, and this way you can keep the starter gears in check. The other thing is, if you want to fling it out to the back of the bike like I am going to do, I forgot to tell you something. This essentially is hooked up to the engine, I mean the cover, by these cables. That comes from the generator, the 3 phases, and of course the ignition trigger, the pickups. So what we need to do is unhook this cable organizer. It just squeezes. It is a sheet metal jobby. It squeezes and it pulls out. So you take that out and you have a bit more room to move the cover. So I'll be back as soon as the cover is off, this time for real. Okay, the cover is off, it's hanging there, and yeah, you might end up with the starter gears like that, and then you might be sitting there, oh gosh, how to put them back together, in what order and what not. So I'm going to pull these things out like so, in a cluster, and there's a gear on the inside with the flat facing out, and there is this dampened washer. There's a layer of rubber between the 2 sides, so that goes like this, and that's what we have in there. That's the Bendix fork I mentioned. Obviously the one without the bolt hole, without threads, that goes towards the inside of the engine, and that is where the countersunk screw is going to go. And of course you have the idler gear with the return spring and that splined shaft jobby that I mentioned the last time. I got a few interesting questions regarding this. I'll wipe my hands, set the camera up, and I'll get back to it in a second. The last time I mentioned this lateral force and the spring clip providing braking force to the idler gear that moves in and out on that spline shaft, on that spiral track. And some people in certain Facebook groups did not really understand the principle behind it. When you spin this and nothing tries to stop or slow down or pinch this gear, nothing holds it, it is like turning the head of a bolt which has a nut on it, and that drags the nut with it. It will not move, I mean the nut will not move along the threads of the bolt, but as soon as you hold the nut down so the bolt can turn independently, you will see that the nut will travel in or out on the threads. Same shit happens here. Nothing, because the starter just spins the idler gear. But if you try to slow the idler gear down, I try to do it with my finger, then it is going to try and come out, and that's how it will mesh, obviously. Now this is a 2nd generation system, but this part is very similar, and the principle is very similar with this spiral track jobby. Now our culprit is right there, and this is the starter clutch, which is supposed to spin in one way, but it should not spin in the other way. And I've seen people telling or being upset because their starter clutch, they took it out, they were told that it is faulty, they took it out, they tried it by hand, and it did not slip, and they were furious that some idiot told them to replace the starter clutch, but it feels perfectly fine. Well, I understand if you think that you're a strong guy, but you're not strong enough. to make it slip. The starter motor can make it slip. So yes, if it whines like mine did, you need to take it off and chuck it and put a new one in. Now, as you can see, the only thing that holds it in place is that spring clip, and it slips on a spline shaft. So you can take 2 small screwdrivers and pry that thing apart, or you can use one of these Ziegler pliers, spread the spring clip, put it to one side, and then you can pull this thing off. It interferes with my gasket, and I need both hands to wiggle it out and get the new one in place, which I'm going to show you in a second. So yeah, bear with me. I'll put the camera down and I'll come back as soon as I wiggled it out. So here are the starter clutches, and I'm not sure if I'm in focus, but I'll try and refocus. So this is the old one, the worn one. As you can see, this turns wherever it wants to, whenever it wants to. Sometimes both ways, sometimes just one way. So this, once the clip is off, it just slips off, and you take the new one and it just slips on, and then we put the clip back on. I'll be back as soon as I've done that. Okay, old starter clutch out, new starter clutch in, and the spring clip is in place like it's supposed to be. That is the bushing for the shaft that holds the starter gears, and this here is the hole machined in the cover which guides the pin on. Just a sec, I'll get the fork without don't go away, on this Bendix fork. Now when you have a first generation bike and you want to convert your starter system to second generation, because the casings are very similar, so you have the same bushing, it's at the same location. Like I said, even the principle is the same. This one is just aided by mechanical electromechanical fork. So the point is, some of the first gen bikes can be upgraded with a second gen cover, a second gen solenoid and whatnot, if this is inside the case, if that is present. On some of them that is not present. I'm not sure if you can see, there's this weird shape there that guides that pinching spring clip I mentioned when I was talking about the first gen bikes, and this is the other guide which pinches the idler gear. So the casings are very, very similar between the first and the second generation, but there are small alterations which, if they are present, obviously you can upgrade your starter system to a second gen one, but if it's not there, tough cookies. Right, now we need to put everything back. In order to illustrate how it goes together, I'm going to align the gears so you can see. There's the dampened washer, that's the inner number 1, it is called the number 1 idler gear. That's the number 2 idler gear. That's the worm shaft or the spline shaft, and that is a return spring. Some people say take the spring out and throw it away. Some people say leave it in because it is an important part of the system. Well, it's difficult to say. There are arguments for and against removing the spring. I'm going to leave it in for the time being. It never caused me any issues. It's just a starter clutch that crapped out after 35 years, so it will stay. So now I need to put this gear set in, which is rather difficult. I put the rear gear, the number 1, in with the shaft that automatically aligned the washer, and it's inside the bushing that's in the casing. And then I put the fork and the number 2 idler on, and finally I'm going to put this spline job in. After a little bit of wiggling, it's in, and as you can see, the return spring tries to push that thing out, so I'm going to put the O-ring on, which should keep it in place until we put the outer cover, the generator cover, back on. The O-rings in place, and as you can see, it keeps everything together nicely. The spring is halfway compressed, it does not kick everything out, so I can go about replacing the gasket because I fucked it up, and once the gasket is on, then I can put the cover back onto the engine, and yeah, we're halfway there. You can start or get your cover started by lining up the shifter shaft and the bolts there on the solenoid, and of course the Bendix fork, and once that is all lined up, you just need to wiggle slowly but surely. It will go together once everything finds its place in the bushes and whatnot. As you can see, it started to go in, so yeah, we just have to wiggle, and I'll be back as soon as it is seated. Okay, as you can see, everything's aligned, that's in place. I can squeeze the case back into its original location. Obviously that goes back in there. That's the neutral sensor, which just needs screwing back. We popped the 5mm or M5, no, actually they're M6, so the thread is 6mm, but the 5mm head Allen bolts back in place in the order that we determined when we dismantled everything. So I'll button everything up and I'll be back. Okay, all buttoned up. We have the Allen bolts back where they belong. I just need to put the cable organizer back in there to keep the cables where they should be. There we go. They are tucked in here, and then the neutral sensor's wire needs to go back there using a JIS screwdriver. I'm not sure if you can see what I'm doing because my hand is quite oily and it's quite dark in here, but yeah, I'll get a screwdriver, quickly nip this up. There we go. Neutral sensor is in place, and then I can put the protective rubber cover back, hopefully. Come on. So yeah, the neutral sensor is back where it belongs. I already put the clutch cable back. Obviously that's not a brain surgery, so just put the cable in. The cable end goes in there diagonally, and then you can hook it in, and once that's done, put everything back, fit the cable back in its bracket, and then set the adjustment on the lever, and then we can put this little cover back on with its 2 screws or bolts, whichever way you prefer, and then we're going to button this up. So I'm going to start with the clutch cover first, and then I'll show you how to put this back together. Okay, so the solenoid is ready to go back together, or the seesaw mechanism. Like I said, the clutch is buttoned up, and like I suggested, I kept everything together. So the bobbin is on the right, the spring is in place, so it's very difficult to fuck up. You have the hook, you hook this in like so, then you tilt the arm back in place, you take the countersunk bolt that holds the bobbin in place, start it in its thread if you can. I struggle because I have only one hand, mind you, but I'll try anyway. Yep, so that is in place, and then the spindle, which is an M5. There we go. You need to wiggle it a little bit so the lever finds its position, and then you can put this, tighten this up, and put the two nuts back together. Again, I need my hands, so I'll be back as soon as we are ready to button this up. Right, so just like yesterday when I told you, or I showed you how this lever arm system works, I'm going to test the functionality. Now, to do this, you don't need to have a key or have it in ignition, because of the working principle of this solenoid. It is fed directly from the battery, and as soon as this actuator is on all the way back, the gears are engaged, and of course the starter is going to turn. So I'm going to push this, and my engine cranks over. Everything's fine and dandy. So now we can button everything up. I pop the cover back on, which I already prepared, and I'm going to put the solenoid cover, this plastic, back from behind with a long JIS screwdriver, and then all we need to do is put the footrest and the shifter back in place. Okay, everything is buttoned up, shifter is back in place, the footrest and everything else is also back in place. One thing I forgot to mention before I started taking everything apart, I marked the shifter, or the position of the shifter, with a Sharpie, and there's already a punch mark right there in the shifter shaft, and that way you could set up everything the way it was before you went into the engine. Now, the other thing that you might have noticed is that we didn't even take this cover off. The reason is we didn't have to. You don't need to take shit off just because it looks like it's in the way. If you read the manual, or if you check the parts diagrams on part supplier sites like Partzilla, Boats.net, Magazip, and similar. So yeah, these sites will show you exploded diagrams of the parts, and you can get a pretty good idea what goes where and what the connections are between these things. When someone fails to do that, that's when the clutch actuator falls apart when you pop the cover off, and you don't know how to put it back together when you pop it on, or if you can put it back together the wrong way, or you forget about taking this off because you think, oh, this is just a small cover that hangs off of the big cover that you need to remove anyway. So you try to pry, and you can break the casing, or you can just bend the Bendix fork that I showed you a few minutes ago. Understand the system. If you know how it works, what makes other parts tick, how they correlate, how they work together, then you have a better rate of success. And that is why I try to be as dry and as methodical as possible, so I can show you how things counteract, and you know how shit happens in there. Because if you know how it works, even if your problem is different from mine, you can figure out what's wrong, because you already know how it works. And if that helped, then all good. Right, that was it. Take it easy.